Welcome back to Sleepy Science History. I hope you're warm, comfortable, and letting the day drift far behind you. Tonight, we're slipping quietly into the deep green heart of an ancient jungle, a place where the air is heavy with mist, and something vast moves just beneath the surface of the river. In this episode, we'll uncover Titanoboa, secrets of the 50-foot snake, the largest serpent ever to live. No rush, no hurry, just a slow journey through time, where every whisper of water and leaf brings us closer to a shadow older than history itself. Stay with me, beneath the canopy of forgotten time. What is the longest shadow ever cast by a creature that no longer walks this earth? It is not a shadow you could see today, not one that falls across your shoes, or your house, or the street. This shadow lies in another time, another world, a place where the air itself felt heavier, wetter, more alive. It belonged to a serpent so long that a school bus could rest along its back, and still the head would lift lazily to watch you from a distance. Its name, whispered through the corridors of paleontology, is Titanoboa. But before it was a name, before it was a fossil in a glass case, before scientists brushed away the black dust of its bones, it was simply alive. Close your eyes for a moment and breathe in that ancient air. You might smell something sweet and overripe, the perfume of fruit falling into dark water. You might hear the deep hum of insects that will never be named by human tongues. Overhead, the trees knit together in an unbroken quilt of green, their leaves so wide they could be roofs, their roots so thick they are walls. This is the Paleocene epoch, a warm, wet cradle for creatures that had survived the ending of the dinosaurs. Just 10 million years earlier, the Earth had shuddered under fire from the sky, wiping away almost every large thing that breathed. Now, life was coming back with a patient kind of courage. The rainforest here, in what will one day be Colombia, is a green cathedral, humid as a breath held too long, and heavy with promise. Somewhere in the murk, in the lazy sway of reeds and the silent weight of still water, something shifts. The movement is not fast, it does not need to be. It is as if a river has decided, quite on its own, to change its course. A slow undulation, a gleam like wet stone, and then stillness again. This is Titanoboa, 50 feet of muscle and patience. Her scales are not jewels but the matte green-brown of swamp shadows, dappled with the shapes of drifting leaves. She does not glisten. She does not need to be seen. You would walk past her, you would drink from the river, and never know she was inches from you. If you listen closely, you might hear the slow intake of her breath, a whisper, not a hiss, the sound of something older than history remembering it is alive. The Paleocene was not a time for haste. The sun here is generous, sometimes too generous, and the rain comes often, sometimes for days, like a blanket draped over the world. The warmth and the water together make everything grow. Trees stretch higher, flowers bloom larger, and reptiles grow to sizes the modern mind might find uncomfortable. The air itself carries more carbon dioxide, like a greenhouse with the windows closed. The heat seeps into everything, giving cold-blooded creatures an extra gift, the energy to grow and grow and grow. Here, the snake is not just an animal. She is a river that can coil. She is a fallen tree that breathes. When she moves, it is not with the jerky, startled reflex of a hunted thing, but with the patient unfolding of a creature that knows it has no equal. Sometimes she waits in the shallows for fish the size of small boats. Other times she curls herself under the dark safety of roots, her body forming a maze for creatures foolish enough to wander in. Every part of her is a promise. The quiet promise of power, of inevitability, of hunger that can wait days, weeks, even months between meals. You might wonder, how could a creature like this vanish from the earth and stay hidden for so long? The truth is, in some ways, she never did. For 60 million years, she lay under our feet, her bones compressed and cradled in the coal seams of ancient swamps. Every storm that came, every leaf that fell, every flood that covered the ground, it all piled above her, pressing her deeper into the slow memory of stone. It would take human hands, much later, to bring her into the light again. Hands blackened by coal dust, working deep underground in the Serpent mines of northern Colombia. The miners were looking for fuel, the compressed remains of ancient plants, but instead they found pieces of something else. A vertebra here, a rib there, too large to belong to anything they knew. At first, the bones looked almost like the branches of a tree turned to stone. But the curve of the ribs, the size of the spine, it was as if someone had built a snake out of stone and then forgotten about it. Scientists came, drawn like moths to the strange shape of the past. They knelt in the dust, brushing away the black grains, mapping each piece. Bit by bit, Titanoboa's skeleton uncoiled from the rock, not in one piece, but like a story told in fragments. 100 vertebrae, each as large as a man's fist. Ribs that arched like fingers cupping the air. And always the same thought, whispered again and again. How large must the rest of her have been? With careful study, they gave her a length 42 feet, at least some saying nearly 50. As long as a bus. As heavy as a small car. A snake that could swallow a crocodile whole. But here, in this first moment of knowing her, we do not need to think of size like numbers. Numbers make things small, neat, and tidy. Titanoboa was none of these. She was the slow tide in a swamp with no horizon. She was hunger shaped like a question mark, curling in the dark. Imagine you are there, in the heat and the hum of her home. You kneel by the water, dipping your hands into the tea-brown current. The water carries the taste of old leaves, of the last rain. Something brushes against your wrist, smooth, warm, and gone in an instant. You look down, but the surface only shows you your own reflection, trembling. Was it her? You will never know. That is her gift, to be both present and absent, to let the forest forget she is there until the moment she decides otherwise. Above, the canopy shifts. Sunlight spills down in broken coins. A bird, bright as a flame, flits between the branches. You almost forget the weight of the thing that moves below, the way the world seems to listen for her. The snake glides on, her muscles working in a chain of quiet power. The river parts for her, closes behind her. Even here, in her reign, she wastes nothing. Not a sound, not a movement, not a breath. She is patient in a way that only the oldest parts of the world understand. And so, as the day folds into its heavy evening, the Titanoboa rests again beneath the black water. Around her, life continues in its slow dance. Dragonflies the size of your hand drift above the surface. Fish turn like silver thoughts beneath it. And far away, rain begins again. It is the kind of rain that sounds eternal, though it will end by morning. In the warmth and the wet, the snake sleeps. She is not dreaming of the far future, of the miners who will find her, of the scientists who will name her. She does not dream of extinction or discovery. She dreams only of the river and the slow, patient unfolding of hunger. And above her, the forest breathes, slow in, slow out, as if the whole world is content to wait. Some shadows never leave. They may hide beneath the earth. They may coil themselves in the folds of time, but they remain, waiting for someone to step close enough to notice the cool place they have left behind. Titanoboa is such a shadow. Not gone, not really, only sleeping beneath 60 million years of silence. The heat that breathed giants. What would the world feel like if the air itself was a warm hand, cradling every creature alive? Not the kind of heat that makes you run for shade, nor the sharp, dry heat of deserts, but a gentle, soaking warmth that wraps around you, like sinking into a bath that never cools. That was the Paleocene, the world Titanoboa knew 60 million years before you were here to think about her. Back then, Earth was still catching its breath after the great ending of the dinosaurs. The wounds of the impact had closed, but the memory of it lingered in every seed and shell. The continents wore slightly different shapes, like a familiar face seen through rippling water. And the climate was something altogether different. You can imagine it if you try. A greenhouse without walls, the windows closed, the air heavy with moisture, warm enough that even at night, you could step into the forest barefoot and feel no chill. The poles were almost tropical. Ice had retreated to the dreams of the far future. The air carried more carbon dioxide. Not something you could see, but something you could feel in the richness of leaves, in the boldness of flowers, in the sheer size of the creatures it fed. Plants grew with a kind of confident extravagance. The forests were not just green. They were green turned up to its brightest setting, every leaf swollen, every stem stretching. The canopy above was so thick it caught the sun like a net, turning the light into a soft gold that trickled to the floor in scattered pools. In this softened light, reptiles reigned. And here is where the warmth whispered its secret. It was the perfect gift for creatures like Titanoboa. Cold-blooded beings live at the mercy of their surroundings. Their muscles, their digestion, their very thoughts run faster when the air is warm. In the Paleocene, the warmth was endless, and so was the opportunity to grow. Titanoboa was not a monster born in defiance of her time. She was its child, its natural outcome. Picture her in that climate. She is coiled along a bank of soft mud, the heat from the air and the water wrapping around her like layers of silk. She has no need to hurry. Warmth is stored in every muscle, every scale. Her size is not a choice but a gift from the world, a reflection of its generosity. In colder ages, a snake's body might grow sluggish, smaller, restrained by the limits of temperature. Here, she can be as large as her appetite and the forest's abundance allow. In a way, you could say Titanoboa was a mirror. Look into her length, her strength, her patient eyes, and you see the climate itself. A giant snake could only come from a giant warmth. The rivers of this ancient rainforest were slower, deeper, and darker than most waters today. Rain fell often, feeding them until they overflowed into swamps and lagoons. The forest floor was a tapestry of damp soil, fallen leaves, and sudden pools. There was no dryness here, no season of withering. Everything stayed lush, breathing in the heavy air like it was a shared language. That language was written in steam. Every morning, as the sun touched the treetops, mist would rise from the forest like breath from a sleeping giant. It curled between branches, draped over vines, blurred the edges of reality. If you stood still in that hour, you would feel the mist gather on your skin, clinging like the memories of dreams you've just left. The animals knew this world as intimately as you know your own home. Giant turtles, broad as tables, pushed through the water with slow, steady strokes. Crocodiles, some as long as today's boats, glided along with eyes just above the surface. Fishes shimmered beneath them, large enough to feed a village. And threading through it all, invisible until she chose to be otherwise, was Titanoboa. Warmth is not only a giver of size, but also a giver of slowness. In a world without winter, time feels different. There is no rush to bloom before frost, no scramble to store food for a lean season. Creatures grow with patience, moving to the rhythm of rivers and rains. Titanoboa's hunt might take days, not because she could not move quickly, but because she did not need to. She could wait in stillness for as long as the moment required. The heat kept her ready. The air fed her without food. And when she finally struck, it was with the precision of something that had no fear of missing. In the Paleocene, hunger was patient. Life was patient. Scientists, millions of years later, would read these truths from stones and bones. They would compare the size of Titanoboa's fossilized vertebrae to living snakes, tracing curves and measuring widths, building formulas to guess her length. But bones are only half the story. The other half is written in the climate she came from. A climate they could measure through trapped pollen grains, through chemical signatures in ancient leaves, through the rings of fossilized trees. Each one told the same tale. It was warm, so very warm. From this warmth came abundance. From abundance came size. From size came the reign of the great serpent. Imagine yourself there, standing by the river in the golden light after rain. You reach up to push aside a broad leaf, slick with droplets. The forest smells like wet earth and life itself, thick, green, and endless. Somewhere, a deep, low call of a bird echoes, as if the forest is speaking to itself. You feel the air pressing against your skin, not unpleasant, just insistent, like it wants to remind you of its presence. In the water, something ripples. You do not see her yet, but you sense her, the way you might sense a storm before you see the clouds. It is not fear you feel, it is awe, the quiet understanding that you are sharing this place with something made entirely for it. And maybe you understand, for a moment, that her size is not a threat. It is simply what the world has asked her to be. Even the nights here are warm. As darkness falls, the forest hums with life. Insects trill and click, frogs sing from unseen pools, and the steady drip of water from leaves plays its soft percussion. Titanoboa slides through it all, unseen but present, her body holding the day's heat like a banked fire. Somewhere she will rest, perhaps coiled in the hollow of a fallen log, or half submerged in a deep bend of the river. She will wait, as she has always waited, as the forest turns over her in sleep. What would it be like to live in a world without cold? Perhaps we cannot truly know. Our bones remember frost, our history is shaped by seasons. But somewhere, beneath layers of stone and coal, the memory of that warm, endless summer still waits. It waits in the coils of a giant snake that once glided through a world of green and gold. A snake that was not a monster but a mirror of her time. And when you think of her, not as a fossil, not as a museum exhibit, but as she truly was, you are also thinking of the air that made her possible. You are thinking of a warmth so deep and constant it could make giants out of shadows. The river's patient hunter. What does hunger look like when it has no need to rush? In our modern world, hunger is often sharp. It drives you to act quickly, a reminder that time and food are both limited. But in the world of Titanoboa, 60 million years ago, hunger moved differently. It was not frantic or desperate. It was patient, like a deep current beneath still water. Always there, but unhurried. Here, in the endless summer of the Paleocene, she could wait. The air was warm, the rivers full of prey, and her body, vast and efficient, could store the memory of a meal for weeks, even months. She hunted not every day, but only when the forest whispered the right opportunity. The day begins in a hush, the forest still wrapped in the gauze of early mist. Titanoboa is in the water, half hidden among floating mats of plants. Only the faint curve of her spine rises now and then above the surface, like the shadow of a log drifting on a current. Around her, dragonflies skim in arcs of blue and gold, their wings whispering against the air. Hunting is not a chase for her. It is an art of stillness. Her eyes, small, unblinking, rest just above the waterline. She sees the world in shades of movement and vibration, reading the surface as you might read the lines of a book. Every ripple has meaning. A fish passes close, its scales a flicker of silver in the brown water, but she does not move. It is too small, not worth the energy it would take to catch it. Hunger has taught her this. Not every meal is worth the hunt. Further upstream, the water swells around a deeper bend. Here, the banks slope gently into the river, soft mud dotted with roots. This is where larger prey comes to drink or cross. A tapir-like mammal, short-legged and barrel-bodied, approaches the edge. It is careful, nose lifted, sniffing the humid air. The forest is full of scents. Ripe fruit, wet bark, the musk of unseen animals. But the one it needs to fear is hidden beneath the water, scentless, silent. Titanoboa feels the faintest tremor of its step through the riverbed. The signal travels through mud and muscle until it reaches her. She does not tense. She does not coil like the snakes you might imagine today. She simply waits, her long body already draped along the curve of the riverbank, her tail hidden in weeds, her head nearly invisible beneath a shadowed overhang. When she strikes, it is not fast in the way of a whip. It is fast in the way a door slams in the wind. Sudden, complete, impossible to stop. Her jaws open wide, ribs spreading like the petals of an opening flower, and she takes the creature in a grip that is not about teeth but about strength. Her coils slide around it, one after the other, until it is a prisoner to her patience. Constriction is not a frantic act. It is deliberate. Each time the prey exhales, she tightens. There is no sound but the shifting of her body and the muffled splash of water against the bank. The forest continues its morning song as though nothing unusual is happening. To the forest, this is not unusual. It is the way of things. Minutes pass. The tapir's struggle slows, then stops. Titanoboa does not rush to eat. She waits until the body is still, until the air is calm again. Only then does she begin the long, careful work of swallowing. Her jaws, unhinged and patient, guide the meal inward. Muscles ripple along her length, pulling it down, folding it into the slow fire of her digestion. When she is done, the shape of the animal rests inside her like a strange hill in a river. She slides into deeper water, letting the coolness cradle her as her body begins its hidden labor. She will not need to hunt again for many weeks. The rest of the day is a study in stillness. She finds a quiet pool where fallen branches make a tangle of shade, and she settles there, half submerged. Small fish gather in the shadows around her body, darting between her scales. A turtle climbs onto the curve of her back, mistaking her for a log. She does not mind. In the water, her presence is both unnoticed and undeniable, a part of the river itself. Above, the forest moves in slow rhythms. Leaves drift down from the canopy, each landing with a soft sigh on the water. The sun climbs, warming the air until it feels like silk pressed against the skin. Somewhere far off, thunder murmurs, promising the rain that will come later. Titanoboa feels the vibration of it in the water before you could hear it in the air. Hunting, for her, is not just about food. It is about balance, knowing when to wait, when to strike, when to vanish again into the background of roots and shadows. She is never wasteful. She does not chase what she cannot catch, nor eat what she does not need. She lives within the steady economy of the forest, where every action is measured and every life is part of a larger pattern. To watch her hunt is to watch time slow down. You begin to notice things you might never see otherwise. The way light bends in water, the tiny eddies that form around a submerged branch, the way a single drop of rain rings outward in perfect circles. Her patience teaches you patience. Her stillness teaches you how much can happen without movement. Night in the rainforest is a different kind of hunting ground. The air grows even thicker, holding the day's heat close. The river becomes a black ribbon, its surface shining in starlight. Titanoboa's body moves through it with no sound, only the faint, moonlit shimmer of her passing. She does not always eat in the day. Sometimes, when the banks are quiet and the forest hums with nocturnal voices, she will rise from the depths to take a bird sleeping low on a branch, or a mammal coming to drink under cover of darkness. The night belongs to her as much as the day, and in both, her method is the same: patience, stillness, precision. What does hunger look like when it can afford to wait? It looks like a giant serpent resting in the shallows, her body a living echo of the river. It looks like days and weeks passing without urgency, every meal earned by timing rather than chase. And perhaps, in some way, that is why she survived as long as she did. In a world that could be violent and sudden, she met it with calm inevitability. Hunger never ruled her. She ruled it. In the deep hours of the night, the rain begins. It falls softly at first, then harder, until the river swells and the air is full of the scent of wet earth. Titanoboa rests in her hidden pool, the sound of the rain above muffled by the water around her. She will not hunt again for a long time. Her body will turn the memory of this meal into strength, into stillness, into more days spent drifting beneath the green roof of the Paleocene forest. And somewhere in the dark, the river carries her forward, slow and certain, as though it knows there is no need to hurry. In the company of giants. What happens when a world is warm enough, gentle enough, to let everything grow beyond the limits we know today? The Paleocene rainforest was not a stage for Titanoboa alone. She was only one thread in a vast tapestry, woven with creatures as strange and immense as dreams. To imagine her without them would be like describing the ocean and leaving out the waves. In her world, size was not an exception, it was an unspoken rule. Warmth and abundance whispered the same promise to every living thing: grow and grow again. And so they did. The river was home to more than the serpent. Here swam giant turtles, their shells as wide as dining tables, their dark eyes deep with the calm of creatures that could outlive generations. They basked on muddy banks, unhurried, their heads lifting slowly to taste the air. To them, The river was a lifetime's companion, feeding them, sheltering them, carrying them when the floods came. Some of these turtles would have been heavy enough to sink a small boat, but to Titanoboa, they were simply part of the scenery, sometimes ignored, sometimes hunted, depending on her hunger. They shared the same waters without fear most days, like neighbors who nod in passing but keep their own business close. Then there were the crocodiles. Not the ones you know. These were ancient titans, stretching longer than the height of two grown people, their armored backs rising from the water like jagged islands. They floated silently, letting the river carry them until the sudden moment of a strike. Crocodiles and Titanoboa were both masters of stillness, and in that stillness lay an unspoken truce. Each understood the other. There was no need for constant conflict, only rare, decisive moments when paths crossed in the wrong way. A young crocodile might vanish into the serpent's coils, while a careless snake might find herself ambushed by jaws that closed like falling gates. Most of the time, though, they passed each other without incident, each predator carrying the weight of its own hunger. Above the river, the forest floor held its own giants. Mammals were still young in this world, but some had already claimed their size. There were ungainly, tapir-like beasts that foraged in the undergrowth, their noses questing among the ferns. There were rodents bigger than modern dogs, with sharp teeth and bold eyes, gnawing through tough fruits that would challenge anything smaller. And in the shadows moved birds that could not fly, tall, long-legged creatures with powerful beaks. They stepped through the undergrowth like silent hunters, their heads darting forward to snatch a lizard or a small mammal. To see one was to be reminded that not all danger in the forest came from teeth in the water. The air itself was full of life. Insects the size of a child's hand floated on heavy wings. Some carried colors so bright they looked as though the rainforest had painted them with pieces of sky. Others, like giant dragonflies, darted in straight, purposeful lines, their gossamer wings catching the light like shards of glass. These insects were not just decoration. They were the messengers and gardeners of the forest, carrying pollen, breaking down fallen leaves, feeding both fish and birds. Even here, in the land of giants, the smallest lives shaped the greatest. For Titanoboa, this living world was both a home and a hunting ground. She was never alone, even in the deepest pools. The splashes of turtles, the low grunts of mammals in the underbrush, the distant crack of a crocodile's jaws, all were part of her awareness. She could sense the vibrations of their movements through the water, feel the shift of current when something large passed nearby. In this, she was both participant and witness. The forest was not hers alone to rule. It was a shared kingdom, each creature playing its part in the slow, unhurried drama of survival. Imagine standing there on the bank of a Paleocene river. You hear the deep, resonant call of a bird you've never seen before. You watch a giant turtle slide into the water, the sound of its weight breaking the surface like a soft drumbeat. Somewhere, hidden by a curtain of reeds, a crocodile watches. You cannot see Titanoboa, but you know she could be near, her body folded into the shape of the river itself. The air feels heavy in your lungs, sweet with the scent of flowers and wet earth. It is a world that fills every sense, a world that leaves no space for emptiness. Science, millions of years later, would rediscover this abundance through the fossil record. Each bone, each shell, each preserved leaf spoke of the same truth. This was an ecosystem built for giants. And yet, it was balanced, not in the fragile, precarious way we often imagine, but in a deep, enduring rhythm. The warmth allowed plants to grow year-round. The plants fed herbivores. The herbivores fed the great predators. And when those predators died, their bodies fed the forest again, layer upon layer, cycle upon cycle. In such a world, Titanoboa was not an anomaly. She was one note in a vast, ancient chord. A chord you could feel if you listened not with your ears, but with your imagination. Sometimes, when the river was still, she would lie among the giants without moving, her coils resting beside the shell of a turtle, her head only feet away from a basking crocodile. The sun would pour over them all without distinction, warming predator and prey alike. In those moments, The rainforest seemed less like a battlefield and more like a shared cathedral, one where life and death were simply two sides of the same stone altar. Perhaps this is the quiet truth the fossils cannot tell you, that life in the Paleocene was not always about the act of taking, but also about the act of existing alongside. What happens when the world gives you more than enough? Maybe it grows you taller, wider, stronger. Maybe it slows you down, teaches you to wait. Maybe it lets you share the riverbank with creatures that could kill you, and you with them without the need to test it every day. Titanoboa lived in the company of giants, and together they moved through their green, flooded world with a kind of mutual understanding. In a place so vast and rich, there was space enough for all of them, until the world began to change. But that is for later. For now, the river is wide, the air is warm, and the canopy hums with unseen wings. Somewhere beneath the water, the serpent glides. Somewhere above, a bird calls into the golden light. And between them, the other giants move, each carrying their piece of the story, each leaving a trace for the distant future to find. The forest that breathed like an ocean. If a forest could dream, what would it dream of? Perhaps it would dream of rain. The endless, gentle kind that falls for days, feeding every root, every moss-covered stone. Or maybe it would dream of the creatures that move within it, the silent ones, the loud ones, the ones that pass through without leaving a trace. But here, 60 million years ago, the forest was not just a dreamer. It was the dream itself. The Paleocene rainforest was not merely a backdrop for Titanoboa and her kin. It was the pulse, the breath, the heartbeat of their world. Without it, there would have been no giants, no river hunters, no cathedral of green to hide them. In the morning, the forest wore a veil of mist. It clung to every leaf, softened every shape, blurred the lines between branch and sky. The air was damp and sweet, full of scents so thick you could almost taste them. Crushed leaves, wet bark, the faint perfume of flowers hiding in the shadows. The canopy stretched high above, a living roof woven from branches and leaves. Sunlight slipped through in broken coins, glinting off wet surfaces before vanishing again. The light here was never harsh. It was filtered, softened, as though the forest wanted to keep its secrets in shadow. Beneath that roof, the undergrowth formed a world of its own. Ferns as tall as a person, vines that hung in slow arcs, roots that rose from the ground like the backs of sleeping animals. The ground was never silent. It crackled with the movements of insects, the rustle of small mammals, the dripping of water from one leaf to another. The forest was not still. It moved, but not in the way you might first notice. Its movement was the slow reach of vines toward sunlight, the patient push of roots into soil, the drifting of seeds on the humid air. Every breath of wind carried something. A spore, a fragment of leaf, the call of a bird. And yet, for all its lushness, the forest was also a place of shadows. Light rarely touched the floor for more than a moment before shifting away. Shapes could be half seen, half imagined. Even Titanoboa, long as the river she hunted in, could vanish here in plain sight. The forest was a master of hiding, and in this, it gave every creature, predator and prey alike, a shared advantage. This was a forest that fed itself. Leaves fell to the ground and became food for fungi. Fungi fed the soil fed the roots fed the trees, and the trees fed the air. It was a cycle so complete that nothing was ever truly lost. Even death was not an ending here, only a change in form. When an ancient tree fell, it did not leave an empty space for long. Sunlight would pour into the gap, and within days, green would rush upward to claim it. Young plants would stretch greedily toward the light, each leaf unfolding like a slow sigh. Life in the Paleocene rainforest moved at many speeds. Fast enough to fill an empty space in a heartbeat, slow enough to build giants over centuries. The rivers ran through it like veins, carrying the forest's lifeblood. In some places, the water was calm, reflecting the canopy above like a second sky. In others, it moved in slow curves, its brown depths hiding worlds of fish, turtles, and crocodiles. When the rains came, the rivers swelled, spilling into low ground, creating new pools for insects to skim and frogs to claim. These waterways were the great connectors, linking one part of the forest to another. A fallen branch in the current might travel for miles before lodging against a distant bank. Seeds dropped into the water could ride the river into entirely new lands. Even Titanoboa herself could use the river as a silent road, her long body slipping downstream without a sound. If you stood in this forest, you might feel its breath. Not in the quick rhythm of lungs, but in the slow exhale of leaves releasing oxygen, in the long inhale of roots drawing water upward. It was the kind of breath you could only notice if you stood still long enough for the forest to acknowledge you. And when you listened, really listened, you could hear a language older than words. The crack of a branch far away might mean that something heavy had moved. A sudden chorus of birds could signal a predator's approach. The distant splash in the river might be a turtle sliding into safety, or the sound of a serpent feeding. The forest spoke in subtle messages, and every creature knew how to read them. Titanoboa was as much a child of the forest as any tree or fern. The air fed her in its warmth, the rivers gave her paths to follow, the canopy gave her cover. Without the forest's steady generosity, she could not have grown to her great size. Her life and the forest's life were intertwined. One could not have existed without the other. When she rested in the water, half hidden by floating plants, she was a part of the landscape. Birds landed nearby without fear. Insects used her body as a resting place. She carried the forest with her, in the scents that clung to her scales, in the rhythm of her hunts timed to the forest's own cycles. You might think of the rainforest as a single place, but in truth it was many places woven together. High in the canopy, sunlight spilled freely, feeding orchids and bromeliads. Midway down, the air was thick and green, alive with insects and small animals. On the ground, the light was dim and the air cooler, filled with the smell of soil and the sound of hidden rivers. Each layer had its own inhabitants, its own rules, its own quiet dramas. And yet, all of them depended on the others, the way a body's heart depends on its lungs, its bones on its blood. If a forest could dream, would it dream of its own end? The Paleocene rainforest did not know what would come. It did not know that in time, the climate would change, the warmth would fade, and the giants it had nurtured would vanish into the ground. It lived only in the present, in the steady flow of rain and sunlight, in the hum of insects at dusk, in the endless green breath it gave to the world. And perhaps that is the lesson it leaves behind. Not to dwell on what will be lost, but to give everything to the moment you have. In the evening, the forest glowed. The low sun painted the mist in shades of gold and rose. The air cooled, but only slightly, like the gentle loosening of a hand. Night creatures began their songs, and the river mirrored the fading light. Somewhere, in a pool beneath tangled roots, Titanoboa rested. Above her, the forest closed around itself for another night, its breath deep and slow. Here, in the warm dark, you could believe the forest was eternal. And in a way, it still is, living on in stone, in fossils, in the quiet memory of a serpent who once moved through its green heart. When the warmth began to fade, what does the end of an age feel like when it arrives so slowly you cannot see it coming? Some endings arrive with fire and thunder, with the suddenness of an asteroid striking the sea. But others drift in quietly, so gradual they seem like nothing at all. The Paleocene rainforest, home to Titanoboa and the other giants, would not end in a single day. It would end in the slow turning of the Earth's breath. It began with subtle changes, slightly cooler seasons, rains that did not fall quite as often, or that came all at once and then left the rivers lower than before. To the forest, it was a small shift in the music, a change in key so soft most of its players continued as if nothing had happened. But the song was already different. The warmth that had once been constant, wrapping every creature like a soft blanket, began to loosen its hold. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that the air's gift to cold-blooded giants began to waver. For Titanoboa, this change was invisible at first. Her river still carried her. The forest still fed her. She could still lie in the shallows and feel the heat of the day stored in the water. But slowly, the warmth she relied on began to shrink from her life, like sunlight retreating into clouds. Cold-blooded creatures are bound to the temperature around them. In the great heat of the Paleocene, Titanoboa had thrived, her muscles and heart quickened by the air itself. Now, the cooler turns meant she needed more time to warm before she could hunt, more energy to move in the same way. Her body could still grow large, but the potential for even greater size began to narrow. The forest felt it too. Some trees, used to the endless humidity, began to falter when the rains shifted. Their leaves fell earlier. Their seeds sprouted slower. Insects that depended on those plants followed the same pattern, shrinking in number. Birds that fed on the insects had to search longer. One thread pulled at another, and the tapestry began to loosen, even if only at the edges. The rivers also changed. They still swelled in the rainy months, but in between, their levels dipped lower, and their waters grew clearer where they had once been dark and deep. Shallower rivers meant less cover for a serpent the size of Titanoboa. The wide, shadowed pools she once preferred became fewer. Prey still came, but sometimes from further away, sometimes in smaller numbers. If you were there, standing quietly on the bank, you might not notice the difference from one year to the next. The dragonflies still danced in the air. The giant turtles still heaved themselves onto the banks to bask. The crocodiles still floated like logs, waiting for the right moment to strike. But beneath this familiar surface, the balance was shifting. Titanoboa still hunted, still mastered the patient art of the river's ambush, but the intervals between her meals began to stretch. She was no less skilled, but the world around her was just slightly less generous. The forest's heartbeat was slowing. In the language of deep time, this was the earth adjusting itself. Ocean currents shifted. The continents inched along their slow paths, changing how winds carried warmth and rain. To any single creature, it was imperceptible. To the forest as a whole, it was a soft but steady turning toward something new. The gift of size, the same gift that had given the world Titanoboa, the giant turtles, the massive crocodiles, was no longer given so freely. Cooler days meant less energy for cold-blooded bodies. Fewer plants meant fewer herbivores, which meant fewer prey for the predators. The chain was intact, but each link grew just a little thinner. And yet, the forest did not mourn. Nature does not cling to a single shape for long. It simply reshapes itself, even when the old forms are lost. New creatures appeared, smaller, quicker, more adaptable to the shifting climate. Mammals, once modest in size and number, began to explore more of the forest's pathways. Their warm-blooded bodies gave them an advantage in the cooling air. They could move and hunt in conditions that slowed reptiles. Titanoboa was still the largest thing in the river, still a shadow that could take a deer-like mammal in a single strike. But she was no longer the inevitable outcome of the forest's design. The age of giants was slowly giving way to an age of nimbleness. Imagine her now, coiled in a pool at the bend of the river. She is older, heavier, her body marked by the faint scars of a long life. The day is overcast, and the water holds less warmth. She moves less often now, saving her energy for when the moment is right. A small herd of mammals comes to drink, their eyes quick, their steps nervous. She watches. She waits. When she strikes, she still moves with the same inevitability as before. But the chances come less often, and she feels the weight of each one more deeply. The forest still shelters her. The rivers still carry her. But she, like the forest, is adapting, slowly, quietly, without any awareness that she is living in the dusk of her kind. Millions of years later, scientists would find her bones and puzzle over their size. They would measure her vertebrae, compare them to living snakes, and understand that she had been a creature of heat, that her great length had been made possible by a climate warmer than almost any we know today. They would also understand that when the warmth faded, so did the giants. It was not a tragedy in the way we think of it. It was simply the earth turning a page. Titanoboa's chapter was long, full of quiet rivers and golden afternoons beneath the canopy. And when it closed, it left room for other stories to be told, stories of mammals, of forests with new rhythms, of rivers carrying different shadows. What does the end of an age feel like when you live inside it? Perhaps it feels like nothing at all. Perhaps it feels like the same forest, the the same river, the same days of warmth and rain, until one day you realize the air is cooler, the water is shallower, and the giants are fewer. For Titanoboa, there was no single day that marked the end. There was only the slow fading of the warmth that had made her possible, and the quiet arrival of a world that no longer shaped itself for creatures like her. Even so, as long as the rivers ran, as long as the forest stood, she remained part of its story. A long, living shadow moving through the green heart of the Paleocene. And in that shadow, the memory of the great warmth lingered, waiting for someone, millions of years later, to find it written in stone. The long sleep beneath the earth. What happens to a life when it slips out of the present and into the patience of stone? There is a moment always when the body no longer moves. For Titanoboa, it might have been in the cool shallows of a quiet bend in the river, or deep in the tangle of roots where she often rested. Perhaps she was old, her body heavy with years, or perhaps her end came swifter, carried by a sickness the forest could not heal. The forest, in its way, took her back. No creature here is wasted. The same vines that once shaded her now draped over her still form. The same insects that buzzed past her on hunts now came to feed. The water flowed past her, brushing against her scales as it always had. But slowly, quietly, the work of time began. First, the scavengers came, fish and crabs, small reptiles, each taking their portion. This was not cruelty. It was the continuation of the forest cycle, the same cycle she had lived by. What could be consumed was consumed. What could not be eaten settled into the silt. The great coils that had once moved like rivers themselves sank into the riverbed. Mud gathered over her bones. Leaves fell and drifted down through the water to rest on top, forming a soft blanket. Floods came and went, carrying more sediment, more silt, pressing it closer to her. Over seasons, her shape blurred into the bottom of the river. Over centuries, the river's course might have shifted entirely, leaving her buried under what became swamp or forest floor. You might imagine this burial as something final, but in truth, it was only the beginning of a new chapter. Bit by bit, the minerals in the surrounding soil seeped into her bones. They replaced what had once been living tissue, molecule by molecule, until her skeleton was no longer bone at all but stone, a perfect stone memory of what she had been. This transformation did not happen in years, or even centuries. It took thousands upon thousands of years, while above her, the forest lived and died and lived again. New rivers carved new paths. New generations of creatures walked where she had once moved. And still, below it all, she rested. The Paleocene gave way to new ages. The climate cooled further. The giants of her world became fewer. The land that would one day be northern Colombia shifted under the slow, constant motion of the Earth's crust. Layers of rock pressed down above her, each one a chapter of time. The swampy ground above turned to thick beds of plant matter, which, under pressure and time, transformed into coal. That coal would one day draw humans to this place, though that day was still tens of millions of years away. If you could have stood there at any point in those millions of years, you would have seen nothing. The surface would tell you only of the present moment. The trees, the animals, the weather. The great serpent below would be absent from all signs of life, her existence hidden in the patience of stone. And yet she was there, not gone, not erased, waiting in a language of minerals that only time could write. It is strange, isn't it, to think that the earth keeps such secrets? That beneath your feet, the ground may be holding entire worlds you will never know. Forests pressed into coal, shells from oceans long vanished, bones of creatures that have no names in any human tongue. All of them lying there, silent, as the living world continues above. Titanoboa's bones lay like that, curled in their stone sleep. They were no longer a body, yet they still carried her story. The curve of a vertebra, the sweep of a rib, the size that spoke of a world warmer and greener than ours. Above her, the continents continued their slow drift. Mountains rose in the distance. Rivers carved valleys. The air changed. The oceans shifted. Ice came and went. Through it all, she remained, untouched, her stone form locked in darkness. In this way, her time as a living creature was brief. Her time as a fossil was long, far longer than she had ever swum through the rivers or basked in the Paleocene sun. Imagine this deep time as a great, slow tide. In the shallows, where we live, the waves of years lap gently, and we can see each one. But out in the deep, where Titanoboa lay, the tide moves so slowly it feels like stillness. You could stand there for a lifetime and see no change, but the current is always moving, carrying the past into the future. The forest above her changed entirely. What had been a swampy, tropical land might become drier for a time, then flood again, then dry once more. Creatures came and went, some leaving fossils of their own, some leaving nothing at all. Entire ages passed without a single witness who would remember her. And yet, she remained. It would take the arrival of a species not yet imagined, humans, to break the seal of her burial. They came seeking coal, the stored energy of ancient plants. They cut deep into the earth, pulling back layers of rock and soil, opening spaces where no light had entered for millions of years. And there, among the black seams of coal, they found her. At first, perhaps, they thought it was only a strange rock, a piece of petrified wood, the fossil of something smaller. But the curve of the bones told another story. The size of the vertebrae, the spread of the ribs, they spoke of a serpent far larger than anything alive today. The long sleep was over. What happens to a life when it becomes stone? Perhaps it waits for the right hands to uncover it. Perhaps it lies content in the darkness, part of the earth's memory, without need for light or air. Or perhaps it simply exists, no longer a life but no less a part of the world for it. For Titanoboa, the burial was not an ending but a transformation. She lived twice. Once in the warm rivers of the Paleocene, and again in the minds of those who found her and imagined her moving through that green, ancient world. And maybe, in that way, she still moves not through water, but through the currents of thought, coiling through the stories we tell about the deep past. The day the earth let go of its secret. What is it like to hold in your hands a piece of life that has not seen the sun in 60 million years? The morning was warm in northern Colombia, but not with the heavy, ancient heat Titanoboa had once known. It was a different warmth now, filtered through time, through the slow shifting of continents, through the quiet work of the earth remaking itself. The land above was open in places, the air tinged with the scent of coal dust and damp stone. Men moved through the Serpent coal mines, their hands and faces darkened with the work of pulling from the earth what had been buried for ages. They were seeking fuel, the compressed ghosts of ancient forests, not stories. But the earth often gives more than you ask for if you know how to look. It might have been just another shard of rock, overlooked among thousands, if not for the shape. One of the miners noticed it first. A curve too deliberate to be chance, a pattern too regular to be a broken branch or an odd stone. It was heavy in the hand, the way stone is, yet it held the whisper of something once alive. News travels differently underground, not in spoken words alone, but in the way people gather to look. A small group bent over the find, turning it in the light, brushing away the dust with calloused thumbs. They saw lines that might have been ribs. They saw a smoothness that suggested the polish of water long gone. They set it aside. Not long after, scientists were called in. They came with brushes, with soft tools, with a patience that matched the patience of the fossil itself. They crouched in the coal dust, tracing the shape of the vertebra with gentle fingers, measuring the span of the bone. In that moment, they knew they were looking at something extraordinary. This was no small snake, no modern reptile. This was something that had once been vast. The work began slowly. Fossils do not reveal themselves all at once. They must be coaxed from the stone. Layer by layer, the scientists freed each piece, each vertebra, each rib. The black of the coal contrasted with the pale fossil, like night giving way to dawn. You might imagine a fossil as a single, perfect skeleton lying in the ground like a sleeping animal. But the truth is different. Time shifts the earth, scatters bones, breaks them into fragments. The scientists collected each one carefully, like words from a book that had been torn apart, knowing they would have to piece the story together later. And the story was clear in its scale. Vertebrae the size of fists, ribs that arched far beyond the span of any living snake. Each fragment was a note in a song of size and strength, a song that had not been heard for millions of years. They studied the bones with the tools of modern science, scanning them, comparing them to the skeletons of living snakes, calculating their size not just in length but in mass. The numbers grew with each estimation until they settled on something that seemed almost impossible. A serpent that had stretched over 40 feet from head to tail, as long as a bus, weighing more than a ton. It was not just a snake. It was the snake, the largest that had ever lived. And it had once slid silently through rivers and swamps where the coal miners now stood. Imagine, for a moment, standing in that mine as the realization took shape. The air smells faintly of oil and stone. Around you, machinery hums in the distance. But in your hands you hold a fragment of another world. A piece of something that lived before there were mountains here, before there were humans to wonder at it. It is like holding time itself, heavy and solid, yet impossibly fragile in its meaning. The scientists named her Titanoboa cerriginensis, the great boa of Cerrigen. But naming her was only the beginning. To know her fully, they would have to reconstruct her life. The climate that allowed her to grow so large, the rivers she hunted in, the prey she took, the rivals she faced. Every detail they uncovered would be a thread pulling the past closer. They returned to the mine again and again, finding more pieces, not just of Titanoboa but of her world. Fossilized leaves the size of dinner plates, seeds from trees long vanished, the remains of giant turtles and crocodiles. Each find was a companion to her story, a reminder that she had not lived alone, but in a kingdom of giants. It is a curious thing to realize that the heat and humidity of that ancient time, the very conditions that gave Titanoboa her size, were recorded not just in her bones, but in the shape of the leaves, in the kinds of plants that grew. The forest had left its fingerprints in stone, and the scientists read them with the same care they gave her vertebrae. And so, bit by bit, the Paleocene rainforest began to take shape again, not in the flesh but in the mind. In their imaginations, the scientists walked beneath a green canopy dripping with rain. They watched the river slide past, brown and slow, hiding its greatest predator. They could almost see her, a shadow in the water, a movement in the reeds. Her story was no longer locked in stone. It was moving again in papers, in lectures, in the quiet awe of those who saw the fossils in museums. People began to imagine what it would have been like to live in her world, to share the rivers with her, to watch her move through the water like a living current. In this way, discovery is a kind of resurrection. Titanoboa would never slide through the rivers again, but she could move through human thought, uncoiling in the minds of those who learned her name. What is it like to hold in your hands a piece of life that has not seen the sun in 60 million years? It is to feel the thinness of the boundary between past and present. It is to know that time does not erase. It only buries and waits. It is to see that the earth remembers everything, even the coils of a serpent that once ruled the rivers. And when that memory is lifted into the light again, it is as though the earth is telling you a story it has been keeping for far too long. Breathing life into stone. How do you rebuild a creature that has not breathed for 60 million years? It begins with fragments. A single vertebra, the curve of a rib. Pieces that, on their own, are nothing more than elegant shapes in stone. But if you have the patience to look closely, to measure, to compare, the pieces begin to speak. The scientists sat with Titanoboa's bones as one might sit with a story told in a language half forgotten. Each vertebra became a syllable. Each rib became a pause, a breath, a subtle shift in meaning. Together, they would form not just a skeleton but the outline of a life. They started with size. Her bones were compared to those of modern snakes, boas and anacondas, their proportions carefully measured. A single vertebra from Titanoboa was wider than a man's hand. Multiplied along her spine, it suggested a length so great that the mind had to stretch to contain it. Over 40 feet from nose to tail, weighing more than a ton. But numbers alone could not tell her story. Numbers are dry. They do not glisten in the rain. They do not glide beneath the surface of a river. And so the scientists added more layers, drawing on every scrap of evidence they could find. Fossilized leaves told them about the climate. Their shapes and sizes whispered of a world hot and heavy with moisture, a place where cold-blooded creatures could grow without limit. Fossilized turtles and crocodiles told them about her diet, their shells and bones bearing marks that might have been left by the crushing coils of something far larger than themselves. Even the coal around her spoke. It had once been the forest floor, dense with fallen leaves and rotting wood, pressed into black stone over millions of years. From this, the scientists knew she had lived in a rainforest not unlike the great green cathedrals of today's Amazon, though even more lush, more alive, more constant in its warmth. They built her not only from evidence, but from analogy. They watched living anacondas move through South American rivers, noting the way their bodies rippled with each stroke, the way their eyes sat just above the waterline. They studied the hunting patterns of giant snakes, the patient stillness, the sudden strike, the slow, methodical swallowing of prey. And then, in the quiet of their work, they imagined her. They saw her in the morning mist, half in the water, half on the bank, her scales patterned in shadow and light. They felt the weight of her coils pressing against the muddy riverbed. They heard the soft exhale of her breath, the near silence of her movement. Science, at its heart, is a kind of dreaming, a dreaming grounded in evidence but dreaming nonetheless. The scientists knew Titanoboa not just through her bones, but through the way those bones fit into the rhythm of the world she once knew. They placed her in the river with the turtles, the crocodiles, the strange mammals of her time. They set her beneath a canopy dripping with rain. They gave her the slow, deliberate power of a creature without predators, a creature shaped entirely by the generosity of her climate. You might imagine their work as the slow painting of a portrait. First the outline, the length, the mass. Then the environment, the forest, the river, the weather. Then the details. The way light might have fallen across her scales, the way her muscles bunched before a strike, the way her body curved in rest. Each stroke came from evidence, but the whole painting came from something more, a willingness to stand in the space between knowledge and wonder. They knew she was an ambush predator. Her size made her slow over long distances, but her power made her unstoppable up close. They imagined her lying in wait at the edge of a deep pool, her body hidden beneath floating plants. They pictured the ripple of her muscles as she closed the distance to a drinking mammal, the suddenness of her strike, the coils drawing tight in silence. They could almost feel the river's current wrapping around her as she fed, almost smell the heavy, wet air of her world. But their work did not end with imagining her alive. They also traced the shape of her death and burial, the slow sinking into the riverbed, the covering of silt, the long transformation into stone. They considered the pressures that turned her bones into fossils, the geological changes that hid her away for so long. By understanding her death, they understood her life more deeply, for the same rivers that carried her prey also carried the sediments that would one day preserve her. Sometimes, in the lab, the scientists would hold one of her vertebrae in their hands, turning it under the light. The stone was cool, its surface etched with the patterns of time. But if you looked closely, you could see the logic of her spine, the engineering of strength and flexibility perfected over millions of years. It was humbling, they said, to realize that this fragment had once been part of something that could move with such grace through the water, that could wait so patiently for the right moment to strike. How do you rebuild a creature that has not breathed for 60 million years? You begin with what you know. You add what you can measure. You borrow from the living to understand the dead. And then, when the evidence runs out, you stand quietly in the space between facts and possibilities, and you let your mind drift back to the world as it was. That is how stone breathes again. Not literally, not in the way it once did, but in the way it moves through the mind, alive in thought if not in flesh. In this way, Titanoboa returned to the world. She swam again in museum displays, in documentaries, in the imaginations of those who read about her. She became more than a fossil. She became a reminder of how strange and generous the earth can be when conditions are just right. And perhaps most importantly, she became a connection, a bridge between the warm, wet rivers of the Paleocene and the people of today, who may never walk in such a place, but who can feel, for a moment, what it might have been like. If you'd like, I can now write chapter 10, the final chapter, keeping the same soothing tone, but drawing the story toward a reflective conclusion, looking at Titanoboa not just as a creature of the past, but as part of a timeless pattern of life, change, and memory. It would leave the listener with a sense of quiet wonder. Shadows that do not fade. When a life is gone, what remains of it in the great turning of the world? Perhaps you think of bones, of fossils pressed into stone. Or perhaps you think of stories, of names whispered in classrooms and museums. But there are other traces, quieter ones, left behind in the folds of time. Traces you cannot see, but can feel if you listen long enough. Titanoboa has been gone for 60 million years. And yet, in a way, she has never left. She is in the warmth of the tropics, in the stillness of a river's curve, in the patience of a hunter who waits as long as it takes. She exists in the way the earth remembers. We began this journey in the steaming green of the Paleocene rainforest, with a serpent as long as a bus moving through water dark as tea. We followed her through her patient hunts, through the company of giants, through the living cathedral of the forest. We felt the slow change of climate, the quiet burial beneath silt and coal, the long sleep of stone, and the moment when human hands lifted her back into the light. Now we stand at the edge of that story, looking back across millions of years. The path behind us is made not of footsteps, but of rivers and rain, of leaves falling and bones sinking, of continents drifting and forests changing. It is tempting to think of her world as separate from ours, as if it were sealed behind a glass wall of time. But the truth is softer than that. The air you breathe now carries the same molecules that once swirled through her rivers. The rain that falls on your window may have fallen on the leaves above her head. The earth does not start over each time. It reuses, reshapes, recycles. Titanoboa's time is part of yours, even if the connection is quiet. Science tells us she was the largest snake ever to live, her size made possible by the heat and abundance of her age. But size is only part of her truth. The rest is in the way she fit into her world, not as a monster, but as a piece of a balanced whole. She was no more unnatural than the trees that shaded her, no more extraordinary than the turtles that swam beside her. In the Paleocene, she was not a legend. She was simply alive. If you could walk that world now, you might not notice her at first. You would hear the birds, smell the wet earth, feel the humid air on your skin. The forest would surround you in layers, branches overhead, ferns brushing against your legs, water sliding past your feet. She could be inches away, and you would never know until she chose to move. And when she did, it would be like watching the river itself decide to shift its course. Slow, steady, unstoppable. It is strange, isn't it, how the passage of time can turn the ordinary into the miraculous. Titanoboa was no myth to those who shared her river. She was a fact of life, as real as the rain, as expected as the turning of day into night. But to us, she is a wonder. This is the gift and the trick of deep time. It changes the way we see. Distance transforms a creature into a story, a shadow into a symbol. She is still a snake, but she is also the warmth of an ancient climate, the patience of a predator, the memory of a world that no longer exists. And what of her shadow? Not the one she cast in the Paleocene sun, but the one she casts now in our minds, in our science, in the way we think about life on Earth. That shadow stretches beyond rivers and forests, beyond the boundaries of her own age. It touches the present, reminding us that the Earth's history is vast, and that we are only one moment within it. When we imagine Titanoboa, we are really imagining ourselves into the deep past, into a place where the world was warmer, greener, slower. We are borrowing her shape to travel through time. Perhaps this is why her story feels soothing, even in its grandeur. It is not a tale of sudden endings or violent disasters. It is a slow unfolding, a life lived, a world changed, a body returned to the earth. It is a reminder that not all change is quick, and not all loss is loud. Some endings are gentle, almost invisible, until you look back and see how far the river has shifted. And some things, even when gone, are not lost at all. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a museum before her reconstructed form. The room is quiet, the air cool. Before you, the long curve of her spine rises from the floor, a line of vertebrae that once carried muscle, skin, and life. The light catches the stone in soft shadows. You read the name, Titanoboa cerriginensis. You read the numbers, 42 feet, over a ton. But the facts are only the surface. In your mind, you see her again in the brown waters, the green canopy above, the slow coil of her body around prey. You see the rain, the mist, the glint of sunlight on scales. For a moment, she is alive again. When a life is gone, what remains of it? Sometimes it is bone. Sometimes it is stone. But more often, it is the space it leaves in the world. A space that can be filled by imagination, by wonder, by the quiet knowledge that such a thing once was. Titanoboa's space is wide. It is filled with rivers and forests, with the heat of an ancient sun, with the patience of a predator who could wait as long as it took. It is filled with the memory of a world where size was not excess, but simply the way life expressed itself. And so her shadow remains, not in the water, but in us, in the way we think about the past, in the way we understand the connection between climate and life, in the way we marvel at the possibilities the earth once held and may hold again. Her coils are gone from the rivers, but they are still wrapped around the edges of our imagination. And there they will stay long after the fossils have crumbled, long after the museums have gone quiet, because some shadows do not fade. They move with us as we move through time, just as the earth itself carries all its ages within it. And if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with that part of you that feels the pull of deep time, you can still hear her, moving slowly through the water, breathing in the warm air of her endless summer.